Hello everybody, Shalom. So I'm going to read a little bit from Bart Ehrman's book, Did Jesus Exist? The link will be below if you want to check out the book so you can buy it yourself. And then I'll also read from what's on the screen. And this is about Josephus and whether or not he actually wrote about Jesus. All right, starting on page 58 if you do have the book. In his various writings, Josephus mentions a large number of Jews, especially as they were important for the social, political, and historical situation in Palestine. As it turns out, he discusses several persons named Jesus, and he deals briefly also with John the Baptist. And on two occasions, at least in the writings as they have come down to us today, he mentions Jesus of Nazareth. It is somewhat simpler to deal with these two references in reverse order. The second of them is very brief and occurs in Book 20 of the Antiquities. Here Josephus is referring to an incident that happened in 62 CE, before the Jewish uprising, when the local civic and religious leader in Jerusalem, the high priest Ananus, misused his power. The Roman governor had been withdrawn, and in his absence, we are told, Ananus unlawfully put to death a man named James, whom Josephus identifies as the brother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah, or the so-called Messiah, depending on your translation. Here, unlike the pagan references we examined earlier, Jesus is actually called by name, and we learn two things about him. He had a brother named James, and some people thought that he was the Messiah. Both points are abundantly attested as well, of course, in our Christian sources, but it is interesting to see that Josephus is aware of them. Mythicists typically argue that this passage was not originally in Josephus, but was inserted by later Christian scribes. Before dealing with that claim, I should consider the second passage, the one over which there is the most debate. This passage is known to scholars as the Testimonium Flavianum. That is the testimony given by Flavius Josephus to the life of Jesus. It is the longest reference to Jesus that we have considered so far. It is by far the most important. In the best manuscripts of Josephus, it reads as follows. At this time there appeared Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one should call him a man. For he was a doer of startling deeds, a teacher of people who received the truth with pleasure, and he gained a following both among many Jews and among many of Greek origin. He was the Messiah. And when Pilate, because of an accusation made by the leading men among us, condemned him to the cross, those who had loved him previously did not cease to do so. For he appeared to them on the third day, living again just as the divine prophets had spoken of these and countless other wondrous things about him. And up until this very day, the tribe of Christians named after him has not died out. That's Antiquities 18:3-3. The problems with this passage should be obvious to anyone with even a casual knowledge of Josephus. We know a good deal about him, both from the autobiography that he produced and from other self-references in his writings. He was thoroughly and ineluctably Jewish and certainly never converted to be a follower of Jesus. But this passage contains comments that only a Christian would make, that Jesus was more than a man, that he was the Messiah, and that he arose from the dead in fulfillment of the Scriptures. In the judgment of most scholars, there is simply no way Josephus the Jew would or could have written such things. So how did these comments get into his writings? It needs to be remembered that Josephus, by his own admission, was something of a turncoat in the war with Rome. This is how most Jews throughout history have remembered him. Among his own people, he was not a beloved author read through the ages. In fact, his writings were transmitted in the Middle Ages, not by Jews but by Christians. This shows how we can explain the extraordinary Christian claims about Jesus in this passage. When Christian scribes copied the text, they added a few words here and there to make sure that the reader would get the point. This is that Jesus, the superhuman Messiah raised from the dead as the Scriptures predicted. The big question is whether a Christian scribe, or scribes, simply added a few choice Christian additions to the passage, or whether the entire thing was produced by a Christian and inserted in an appropriate place in Josephus's Antiquities. The majority of scholars of early Judaism and experts on Josephus think that it was the former, that one or more Christian scribes touched up the passages a bit. If one takes out the obviously Christian comments, the passage may have been rather innocuous, reading something like this. At this time there appeared Jesus, a wise man. He was a doer of startling deeds, a teacher of people who received the truth with pleasure, and he gained a following both among many Jews and among many of Greek origin. When Pilate, because of an accusation made by the leading men among us, condemned him to the cross, those who had loved him previously did not cease to do so, and up until this very day the tribe of Christians named after him has not died out. If this is the original form of the passage, then Josephus had some solid historical information about Jesus' life. Jesus was known for his wisdom and teaching. He was thought to have done remarkable deeds. He had numerous followers. He was condemned to be crucified by Pontius Pilate because of Jewish accusations brought against him, and he continued to have followers among the Christians after his death. Mythicists have argued, however, that the entire passage was made up by a Christian author and inserted into the writings of Josephus. If that is the case, then possibly the later reference to James as the brother of Jesus, who was called the Messiah, was also interpolated in order to reinforce the point of the earlier insertion. One of the fullest arguments for this position is offered by Earl Doherty, both in his original work, The Jesus Puzzle, and in an amplified form in his more recent, Jesus Neither God Nor Man. In his view, a good case can be made for saying that Josephus wrote nothing about Jesus and was probably unaware of any such figure. Doherty mounts argument after argument against the view that Josephus made any reference at all to Jesus, often repeating the arguments of others, sometimes coming up with his own. Here I will consider his most important points. First, some, such as G.A. Wells, have maintained that if one removes the entire Testimonium from its larger context, the preceding paragraph and the one that follows flows together quite nicely. This one seems then intrusive. As Doherty rightly notes, however, it was not at all uncommon for ancient writers, who never used footnotes, to digress from their main points, and in fact, other digressions can be found in the surrounding context of the passage, so this argument really does not amount to much. More striking for Doherty is the fact that no Christian authors appear to be aware of this passage until the church father Eusebius, writing in the early 4th century. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries, there were many Christian writers, Justin, Tertullian, Origen, and so on, who were intent on defending both Christianity and Jesus himself against charges leveled against him by their opponents. And yet they never, in defense of Jesus, mentioned the passages of Josephus. Is that really plausible? Wouldn't Christian apologists want to appeal to a neutral witness in support of their claims about Jesus in the face of pagan opposition? This, too, does not strike me as a strong argument. The pared-down version of Josephus, the one that others have thought was original without the Christian additions, contains very little that could have been used by the early Christian writers to defend Jesus and his followers from attacks by pagan intellectuals. It is a very neutral statement. The fact that Jesus is said to have been wise, or to have done great deeds, would not go so far in the repertoire of the Christian apologists. We have no way of knowing if they were familiar with this passage from Josephus, but if they were, I don't see that it would have seemed so striking to them that they would have used it to defend Jesus against pagan accusations. These accusations typically included such claims that he was born out of wedlock to a peasant Jewish woman who was seduced by a Roman soldier, that he was an unskilled carpenter, that he could not control his temper, and that he died a shameful death on the cross. Nothing in the possibly original statement of Josephus seems relevant to any of these charges. Doherty goes on to claim that the passage does not ring true to Josephus otherwise, in part because, in the case of every other would-be Messiah or popular leader opposed to or executed by the Romans, he has nothing but evil to say. This is the case with all messianic pretenders of Josephus's day. He was completely opposed to anyone who might foment an uprising against Rome. Remember, he was writing as a privileged guest in the court of the Roman emperor. But it needs to be stressed that in the possibly original form of the Testimonium, there is not a word about Jesus being a Messiah figure or even a political leader. He is simply a teacher with followers accused on unknown grounds by specifically Jewish leaders and then executed. Moreover, if one reads the passage without the rose-tinted lenses of the Christian tradition, its view of Jesus can be seen as basically negative. The fact that he was opposed by the leaders of the Jewish people would no doubt have shown that he was not an upright Jew. And the fact that he was condemned to crucifixion, the most horrific execution imaginable to a Roman audience, speaks for itself. Even though Jesus may have been a good teacher, he was a threat to the state, or at least a nuisance, and so the state dealt with him fairly and strongly by condemning him. Doherty also objects to the idea that Josephus could call Jesus wise, and one who appears to have taught the truth. If Josephus knew the teachings of Jesus, with which he surely would have vehemently disagreed, then he never could say any such things. To this it can easily be objected on one hand that there is no reason for thinking that Josephus knew any of the things that Jesus taught, and on the other, that many of the things Jesus taught were in fact what many other famous teachers of Judaism taught. For example, that followers of God should love God above all else, that they should love their neighbors as themselves, that they should do good unto others, that they should feed the hungry and care for the poor and oppressed, and well, lots of other things that seem through the ages to Christian believer and unbeliever alike as both wise and true. You can also see my video, which I'll link to below, from Kosher Jesus. I read from that book a little bit, and it talks about how the author thinks that Jesus may have been a Pharisee, because some of the teachings that were considered wise are actually in the Talmud. So, continuing on here. Doherty makes many other points, but most of them, frankly, are even weaker than these and do not need to be given serious attention here. In the revised edition of his book, however, he does devote an extended discussion to summarizing the views of Ken Olson, a graduate student at Duke University who argues that the language of the Testimonium does not appear to be stylistically consistent with the language Josephus uses throughout his other works. Olson has been a student of mine, taking some of my graduate seminars at UNC, and is a very sharp fellow. For what it is worth, he is not a mythicist. Olson's PhD dissertation is devoted to the Testimonium, and many of his key arguments are summarized in an article that he published in the academic journal Catholic Biblical Quarterly in 1999. In this article, Olson argues that the first author to mention the Testimonium, the Christian Church Father Eusebius, who was writing before any of our manuscripts of Josephus was produced, was in fact the one who forged it, and so was ultimately responsible for its being inserted into Josephus's writings. The basis for the argument is a very careful analysis of the words and phrases used in the Testimonium. Olson argues in case after case that the wording and phrasing of the passage has numerous parallels with Eusebius's writings, but not with those of Josephus's. In other words, the vocabulary and style of the passage suggest that it was written by Eusebius. Olson has made an intriguing case in his article, but I am afraid, as impressed by him as I am, that it is not held up under critical scrutiny. The responses to it by such scholars of Josephus and of early Christianity as J. Carlton Paget and Alice Wheely have been compelling. There is in fact little in the Testimonium that is more like Eusebius than Josephus, and a good deal of the passage does indeed read like it was written by Josephus. It is far more likely that the core of the passage actually does go back to Josephus himself. An additional reason for thinking so is this: if a scribe, or Eusebius or anyone else, wanted to insert a strong testimony about the virtues of Jesus into the writings of Josephus so that the Testimonium is a later interpolation, he surely would have done so in a much more glowing and obvious way. Those who wrote apocryphal stories about Jesus are flamboyant, both in what they relate, recounting lots of Jesus' miracles, for example, and in how they say it, stressing his divine nature, not simply that he was the Messiah. The Testimonium is so restrained, with only a couple of fairly reserved sentences here or there, that it does not read like a Christian apocryphal account of Jesus written for the occasion. It reads much more like what you get elsewhere throughout the manuscript tradition of ancient writings, a touch-up job that a scribe could easily do. The payoff is that most scholars continue to be convinced that Josephus did indeed write about Jesus, probably in something like the pared-down version that I quote above. But that is not the main point I want to make about the Testimonium. My main point is that whether the Testimonium is authentically from Josephus in its pared-down form or not probably does not ultimately matter for the question I am pursuing here. Whether or not Jesus lived has to be decided on other kinds of evidence from this, and here is why. Suppose Josephus really did write the Testimonium. That would show that by 93 CE, some 60 or more years after the traditional date of Jesus' death, a Jewish historian of Palestine had some information about him. And where would Josephus have derived this information? He would have heard stories about Jesus that were in circulation. There is nothing to suggest that Josephus had actually read the Gospels. He almost certainly had not. Or that he did any kind of primary research into the life of Jesus by examining Roman records of some kind. There weren't any. But as we will see later, we already know for lots of other reasons and on lots of other grounds that there were stories about Jesus floating around in Palestine by the end of the 1st century and much earlier. So even if the Testimonium in the pared down form was written by Josephus, it does not give us much more evidence than we already have on the question of whether there really was a man Jesus. If by contrast the Testimonium was not written by Josephus, we again are neither helped nor hurt in our quest to know whether Jesus lived. There is certainly no reason to think if Jesus lived that Josephus must have mentioned him. He doesn't mention most Jews of the first century. Recent estimates suggest that there were possibly up to 1 million Jews living in Palestine at any one time in the early 1st century. If you add up the different persons living in any given year, as new people are born and others die, the total numbers of Jews living throughout the period are obviously much higher. Josephus does not mention 99% of them, or rather more than 99%. So why would he mention Jesus? You cannot say that he would have mentioned Jesus because anyone who did all those amazing miraculous deeds would surely be mentioned. As I pointed out earlier, the question of what Jesus actually did has to come after we establish that he lived, not before. As a result, even though both the mythicists and their opponents like to fight long and hard over the testimonium of Josephus, in fact it is only marginally relevant to the question of whether Jesus existed. So I'll read from this article too, and I'll leave the link below for this article also. The works of the 1st century historian Josephus have been held in high regard by Christians throughout history. The early church, Schreckenberg writes, saw Josephus as a kind of 5th gospel and a little Bible, because his works appeared to Christian theologians to be a commentary or a historic appendix to the New Testament. The church's love for Josephus assured him an ongoing role in Western tradition. Closer to modern times, households in France, Holland, and England were known to present newborns with inscribed copies of Josephus right along with the Bible. And thus, it is that the particular references to Jesus have been held historically in the highest esteem, and perhaps also why they have resulted in the most spilled ink. The article will examine objections to the testimony of Josephus. The objections will be put in bold and answered thereafter. We will not investigate the question of Josephus's reliability closely here, for there is little question that Josephus is a generally reliable historian. He had his biases, of course, and he was, unfortunately, something of a traitor to his people. However, questions as to his accuracy as a historian are not what turn up regarding his references to Jesus. Rather, they focus on this question: are these genuine references, or are there doubts about their veracity? There are 2 quotes that mention Jesus in Josephus's Antiquities, a smaller and a larger one. Both of these have been targeted by the Jesus myth circle as interpolations made by later Christian scribes. Wells, for example, rejects the small passage as a partial interpolation or marginal gloss, as did Drews. Stretching the polemic, Wells says that it is widely admitted that both this passage and the larger one are interpolations. Wells' widely estimation is quite a bit off. According to Feldman's discernible statistics, 4 scholars regard the larger passage as completely genuine, 6 more as mostly genuine, 20 accept it with some interpolations, 9 with several interpolations, 13 regard it as being totally an interpolation, as Wells does. 12th tree, offering an unusual view, rejects the smaller passage on rather thin terminological grounds, but strangely accepts most of the larger passage as genuine. Let us begin in the natural place to start by quoting the materials in question. Here's the first and smaller quote. Antiquities 29:1. But the younger Ananus, who, as we said, received the high priesthood, was of a bold disposition and exceptionally daring. He followed the party of the Sadducees, who are severe in judgment above all the Jews, as we have already shown. As therefore Ananus was of such a disposition, he thought he had now a good opportunity, as Festus was now dead, and Albinus was still on the road. So he assembled a council of judges and brought before it the brother of Jesus, the so-called Christ, whose name was James, together with some others, and having accused them as lawbreakers, he delivered them over to be stoned. It is the words the so-called Christ that are thought to be interpolated here. Assuming that this passage is even noticed, some writers I have observed seem to forget that it exists. But let us consider the arguments for and against regarding this as an interpolation. First, there is no textual evidence against this passage. It is found in every copy of the Antiquities we have. This also applies to the larger passage. Some will assert as a counter that there was still sufficient time for an interpolation to occur and not enough textual evidence to prove that it didn't, but this amounts to an admission that the textual data as it stands favors authenticity. Anything beyond that in these terms is speculation and question begging. Second, there is a specific use of non-Christian terminology. The designation of James as the brother of Jesus contrasts with the Christian practice of referring to him as the brother of the Lord or brother of the Savior. The passage squares neither with New Testament nor with early patristic usage. In response to this, Wells objects that an interpolator might well have been aware that an Orthodox Jewish writer could not possibly be represented as calling Jesus the Lord. We do not have to assume that all interpolators went to work with more piety than sense. Wells' argument is refuted by the interpolations themselves. Evidence that interpolators did have more piety than sense is in fact found in the larger passage in Josephus itself, where an interpolator has Josephus confessing that Jesus is the Christ. An interpolator added this sort of sentiment, knowing that Josephus was an Orthodox Jew, then certainly he, or another interpolator, would have been careless enough to refer to James as the brother of the Lord, had this small passage been a forgery. Third, we may note the emphasis of the passage. It is not on Jesus or even James, but on Ananus, the high priest, and the turbulence he caused. There is no praise for James or Jesus. This is not what we would expect if this was an interpolation. Fourth, Josephus' account of James being stoned is different from the account given by the church historian Josephus, who has James being thrown from the roof of the temple. This would be an unlikely move for an interpolator. Fifth, neither the passage nor the larger one connects Jesus with John the Baptist, as we would expect from a Christian interpolator. The bulk of the evidence, therefore, favors highly the genuineness of this passage. Well did J. This is evidence of Christian influence here. In Greek, the passage is the same as that in Matthew 1:16, where it is translated him called Christ without any expressed doubts. France EVJ responds, however, Josephus' usage should be determined from Josephus, not from Matthew. The complete concordance of Flavius Josephus translates legomenos as so-called or alleged, and refers as an example to Josephus. Contra Apionen II, 34, where he speaks of Alexandria as Apion's not birthplace, but alleged birthplace. Even if legomenos does not necessarily carry this dismissive tone in our passage, it is hardly conceivable that a Christian interpolator could have been content with so non-committal a phrase. Glenn Miller has further provided this information. This J reference seems to indicate the shift from title to name, as the standard Greek lexicon ABG indicates, SV Christ. The transition to sense to personal name is marked by certain passages in which Christos does not mean the Messiah in general, even when the reference is to Jesus, but a very definite Messiah, Jesus, who now is called Christ, not as a title, but as a name. This lexicon also points out that this form, as the passive of lego, is routinely understood in this sense and actually cites a different passage from Josephus to illustrate this. Be called, named, Matthew 13:55, HB 11:24, ho legomenos, the so-called. So it's basically giving references to where it's the so-called rather than, it's not saying that he is Christ, it's saying he was the so-called Christ. People called him Christ. They called him that. That's what he was named from the people. And you can see those references. And like I said, I'll leave the link below for you to check them out. Miller also provides indications from the Septuagint, Athanasius, and Eusebius of the use of this word in question. More important here is the usage within the New Testament, showing the term used in both a simple and a disparaging form. First, some simple naming ones. So Matthew 10:2, the first Simon, who is called Peter. So they're using the term who is called, and they're just saying that's what people named him as. They called him Peter. He answered, the man who is called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes, John 9:11. And also Jesus, who is called Justus, Colossians 4:11. Now the disparaging. For even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is but one God, 1 Corinthians 8:5. Therefore remember that formerly you who are Gentiles by birth and called uncircumcised by those who call themselves the circumcision, who call themselves, see, Ephesians 2:11. Therefore, when they were gathered together, Pilate said unto them, Whom will ye that I release unto you, Barabbas or Jesus, which is called Christ? And it goes on again, like Jesus who is called Christ. That's Matthew 27:17-22. There should be little doubt about Pilate's skepticism about the messiahship of Jesus. So what they're saying is just because Pilate calls him Christ, with using this terminology, it doesn't mean that he thought he was the Christ. He's just saying that's what he was called. Miller's key conclusions are as follows. In Josephus, it is either a non-committal record of what the public called Jesus by that time, or a statement that reflects the transition from title to name, e.g. from Jesus the Christ to Jesus Christ. So instead of saying Jesus the Messiah, it's Jesus Messiah, except, of course, the word Messiah was translated into Christos in the Greek, and then that got translated into Christ in English. Or a slightly disparaging reference, the so-called Christ. But note that the disparaging uses documented above always occurred in the oppositional form, a so-called X, not a real X. Matthew's use might reflect the simple naming aspect, identifying the Jesus of the genealogy, or maybe even making a point that a growing body of Jewry had recognized Jesus as the Christ. But it is more likely that Matthew is intending to actually assert more, that Jesus was really the Christ, as he goes about to show in his gospel. It is a sign of Christian interpolation that in the reference Jesus is named first rather than James. A Christian scribe would have given Jesus the top mention. One might ask in reply why Josephus could not also have given Jesus top billing, simply on the basis of Jesus being the more familiar of the two names. Furthermore, note who else Josephus refers to, not just James but also others. If the references were reversed, the result would be a bit clumsy. As therefore Ananus was of such a disposition, he thought he had now a good opportunity, as Festus was now dead, and Albinus was still on the road, so he assembled a council of judges, and brought before it James the brother of Jesus, the so-called Christ, together with some others, and having accused them as lawbreakers, he delivered them over to be stoned. I cannot say whether sense would be made of this in Greek, but in our language at least, this format would leave open the question as to whether Josephus meant that James was the brother of the others as well as Christ, or James and the others were brought before the council. The passage as it now reads leaves no such possible ambiguity. If Jesus did exist, we would expect Josephus to have mentioned Jesus more than once in his histories, and to have said more about him. We would also have expected him to say something about Jesus in his other work, The War. Of course, this presumes that our second reference is itself a complete interpolation, which we will show to be an unwarranted position in a moment. However, even beyond that, it presumes motives for Josephus that the objector should have knowledge of before tendering this as an objection. We must ask what it is specifically about Josephus that would make him want to write more about Jesus. More generally, regarding the amount of space Josephus devotes to Jesus, even including the larger passage, we may note the observation of Williamson that for the entire period of 10 years around which Jesus died, Josephus devotes only one small page in his War and 6 pages in the Antiquities. Therefore, it is actually quite significant that Josephus devotes any attention to Jesus at all, and the lack of mention in the War means nothing. Indeed, Van Verst notes that the Antiquities goes beyond the Jewish War at many points, not just this one. We may now add that there is a second contextual reason for this brief mention of Jesus, adduced by Bjørskog in Story as History. He writes, for Josephus, as for Thucydides and Polybius, contemporary history has a methodological basis in the possibility of personal experience. He wishes for that reason to write in detail only about contemporaneous matters. For Josephus and many historians of the ancient world, the ability to write authoritatively was directly related to how close you were to matters at hand. Since Josephus was not a contemporary of Jesus or his ministry, his methods were such that he naturally would write less about people like Jesus or John the Baptist, and only what could be corroborated by inquiry in his own day, writing in the 90s AD. So now we turn to the second Josephus reference, the Testimonium Flavianum, as it is popularly called. The authenticity of the passage was first questioned in the 16th century. One of its most significant detractors was the French skeptic Voltaire. The passage reads, Antiquities, 18:3-3. Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ, and when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians so named from him are not extinct at this day. That there are interpolations here is seldom questioned. Very few scholars hold that the entirety of the passage is genuine, as we have noted in Feldman's statistics. On the other hand, we have the total interpolation view of G.A. Wells, who points out the many positive things that Josephus says about Jesus in the passage. The middle ground here is certainly most reasonable. Charles Worth derides scholars acting like formal logicians who approach the text with an either-or mentality. The same mentality keeps them from saying that Josephus could have said anything positive about Jesus without accepting his divinity, and thus rejecting all of the nice things said about Jesus in the passage. This is clearly a wrong-headed approach, which does not appreciate the possibility that while some Jews followed Jesus completely, others merely admired him for his honesty, charisma, integrity, and teachings. Elsewhere, Meyer notes that the total interpolation position has its respectable defenders, but it is not a majority view. Among those he cites are Conzelman, who sees the passage as totally an expression of Christian charisma, though without substantiation, and Herman, who regards the Testimonium, the short passage, and the passage in Josephus about John the Baptist as Christian interpolations. Thackeray, whom Meyer describes as the former prince of Josephian scholars, formerly regarded the entire set of passages as a forgery, but later changed to the middle ground view of partial interpolation. Marson adds the comment that Christian copyists were quite conservative in transmitting texts and would have been committing an act of unparalleled scribal audacity by creating the Testimonium out of the whole cloth. Moreover, Christian copyists also handled the works of the Jewish historian Philo for hundreds of years, yet we have no Testimonium Flavianum to wrangle over. Wells, in response, notes that there are supposedly Christian interpolations in the Old Testament pseudeographia, but this is far from established, and Wells does not even deal with the text-critical data and methods associated with identifying interpolations. What are some of the reasons for accepting at least some of this passage as genuine? We can suggest that some of it must be genuine, for it is identifiably in the style of Josephus. The opening phrase, "now about this time," is used regularly by Josephus to the point of nausea. Skeptics often counter by saying that someone could have simply imitated Josephus's writing style, an objection which, being unreasonable, has no reasonable answer. But for a complete answer, let's go down the passage one section at a time. Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man. The description of Jesus as a wise man cannot be rejected out of hand, for Josephus and other Jews could have regarded Jesus as a wise man without accepting his divinity, just as is the case with many people today. Of course, on my channel, we don't believe that Jesus or Yehoshua was actually Yahweh. He never claimed to be, in fact, and so, of course, at that time period, nobody's going to be saying that except the very, Roman Catholic Christian people that were gaining strength. But the Jewish people just saw him as, well, a wise man like the Pharisees. So you can see my video on kosher Jesus for more on that, as I mentioned beforehand. So continuing on here. Josephus's language here and throughout the passage, where it is not regarded as interpolated, is a middle ground between Christian acclaim of Jesus as divine and Jewish referral to Jesus as a magician and a deceiver. Against this spectrum, the words of Josephus are neutral and non-committal, and also parallel his treatment of John the Baptist. Moreover, Josephus would have appreciated much of what Jesus said and did. He was not the same as the overzealous would-be militaristic messiahs commonly opposed and defeated by the Romans. Though containing various subversive elements, Jesus' teachings of this sort were directed not against Josephus's Roman patrons, but against the Jewish establishment, and his miracles were never done with a revolutionary purpose in mind, like the pretender Thaddeus's promise to divide the Jordan so that his troops could pass, or the unnamed Egyptians' threat to knock down the walls of Jerusalem. Jesus never came close to this sort of activity, except in certain fantastic theories. And even in his threat to the temple, A, was focused on the Jewish establishment, not the Romans, and B, did not actually threaten the temple himself. Remember, the threat did not say who was going to knock the temple down. So, as Charlesworth writes, Jesus argued against the zealous revolutionaries and was not an apocalyptic fanatic. Josephus would have admired this argument and position. Jesus uttered many wise and philosophical maxims, and Josephus was fond of Jewish wisdom and of Greek philosophy. The second phrase, however, is questionable. It is sometimes rendered, if indeed one ought to call him a man. Like the rest of the suspected interpolations, it is parenthetically connected to the narrative, and grammatically free and could easily have been inserted by a Christian. A Christian interpolator, moreover, would have considered the description of Jesus as merely wise to be insufficient, and so would add something else. The passage is also not found in an Arabic citation of Josephus from the 10th century work Book of the Title, which was analyzed in 1971 by Hebrew University scholar Shlomo Pines, and may represent a more moderate attempt at Christianization of the original text. On another accounting, 12th Tree suggests that Josephus used the word wise in a suspicious or ironic manner. The bottom line, the balance of the evidence points to authenticity for the first phrase and gives moderate probability of inauthenticity to the second. Going on. For he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. The first phrase has also been rendered, for he was one who performed surprising works, and a teacher of people who with pleasure received the unusual. The first phrase would hardly be used by a Christian to describe Jesus' miracles. The difference in translation is owed to the Greek word paradoxos, which can mean strange, surprising, or wonderful. Christian translators would naturally assume that Josephus meant the latter, where he more likely meant the second or first. The second phrase was perhaps the subject of a mistranslation or change, replacing teeth, unusual, strange, with teleth, truth. Although Meyer regards this as an indulgent thing to suppose, and Feldman notes that the new word is not used elsewhere by Josephus, neither of which is a compelling enough reason to outright reject the proposed terminology, but nor is there really any compelling reason to accept it. Neither phrase is the Arabic version, but the reconstruction has found wide acceptance. In addition, Meyer offers speculation that the last phrase may not be complimentary, but rather implying simple-minded enthusiasm, even self-delusion. He also cites Pelletier as saying that as Josephus uses the phrase, it implies no more than the subjective good faith of the listeners, not necessarily the objective truth of what the speaker propounds. So he's saying that the people who were listening had good faith. It's, good faith in him, not that, they're receiving it. So it's just a matter of translations. So, it's obvious translated by Christians in a very nice, positive manner, like wonderful works rather than strange works, etc. So it could have been just a translation issue rather than interpolation too. Continuing on here. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. This is also rendered, he stirred up. Either way would be acceptable as describing what Jesus did without supposing Christian interpolation or belief by Josephus. Indeed, the phrase seems to contradict the Gospels, which do not portray Jesus as dealing with many Gentiles. Meyer regards this as a retrojection of the Gentile mission of Christianity. Then the next line here, he was the Christ. Big, obvious, honking no-no on this one. Though some propose that the phrase here was like the one on the other passage referring to Jesus as the one who was called Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him. For our comments on this section, please see this essay, which I'm not going to read, but like I said, this link will be below so you can check that link out. For he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. Again, a very obvious mistake by the interpolator, though an alert reader has informed me that in the Arabic version, the first phrase is preceded by the words, they reported. Continuing on here. and the tribe of Christians so named from him are not extinct at this day. The term tribe is key here. Thackeray saw this as a pejorative term for the Christians. Meyer disagrees, for Josephus also uses it to describe the Jews, and Eusebius uses it to describe the Christians. The phrase seems best regarded as an expression of surprise, i.e., those Christians are still here. But it is no indication either way in favor of the interpolation. A worthwhile question, of course, is how did these questionable phrases get into the body of the original text? Some suggest duplicity by Christian scribes, but it need not be so horrid. Much as certain people scribble replies in the margins of their books, so some scribes perhaps added the questionable phrases as commentary, and then they were later carelessly incorporated into the text. And of course, if you've ever seen my video on 1 John 5:7 or other videos on 1 John 5:7, you'll know that somebody had written 1 John 5:7 in the side, and that got added into the Bible because it wasn't actually there, because they have tons and tons and tons of manuscripts that don't have 1 John 5:7 in them. It's only after one period of time that they start appearing in the Bible. So it's the same sort of thing. People write things in the margin and then it gets added into the original text. Continuing on here. The passages out of context. This is one of the interpolator, question the mythicists would ask. The passage is out of context. Josephus is discussing Jewish troubles and the Testimonium is out of place. Without it, the text of Josephus runs on in proper sequence, which again, Bart Ehrman had referenced that in his book. This is a favorite objection, but it comes from people who obviously have not read very much of Josephus. As Thackeray opined, Josephus was a patchwork writer, one guilty of inveterate sloppiness. I can agree, as one with a background in language and literature, were I to give Josephus a grade for composition, it would be something around the level of a C-. Even so, the out-of-context charge carries very little weight. An exposition by Mason will be helpful here. This is the outline of events under Pilate as given by Josephus. Meso Jos NT 163-4, using newer outline system for Josephus. 1835, Pilate arrives in Judea. 1855-59, Pilate introduces imperial images in the temple, causing a ruckus. 1860-62, Pilate expropriates temple funds to build an aqueduct. 1863-64, the Testimonium appears. 1865-80, an event set in Rome not involving Pilate directly, having to do with the seduction of a follower of Isis in Rome. 1881-84, an account of 4 Jewish scoundrels, also not directly involving Pilate. 1885-87, an incident involving Pilate and some Samaritans. 1888-89, Pilate gets the imperial boot. As can be seen, this is by no means a set of connected events. Pilate has a role in all of them, but it is not even certain that Josephus is giving these events in chronological order. Wells responds to Thackeray by noting that Josephus often uses phrases that indicate that he is aware that he is digressing. When a writer digresses and confesses for doing so, this does not make him a patchwork writer from whom we must expect any kind of irrelevancy. Wells is simply missing the point here. Confessions of digression indicate a patchwork writer who is conscious of his flaws in this regard. Nor may it be appropriately said that the reference to Jesus is any kind of irrelevancy. If it was a significant event in the reign of Pilate, even in retrospect, as it would be in this case, then it is quite relevant. Even if Josephus' passages are genuine, they would be too late to be of decisive importance. This objection would cause us to have to trash a great deal of ancient history. As Harris points out, our best references to Emperor Tiberius come from historians who lived much later than he did. So this is hardly reason to dismiss Josephus' testimony concerning Jesus. If this is an authentic reference, how is it that Josephus says nothing about the most important Christian belief about Jesus, his resurrection? In fact, we may assert that Josephus does refer to this belief, albeit obliquely, when he indicates that those who loved Jesus at the first did not forsake him, indicating that they were in some way still devoted to Jesus himself even after his death. Even so, this sort of objection presumes to know that there must have been a reason for Josephus to make a more direct mention, and no reason why he should not have, which is easy to assert but rather difficult to prove. Josephus was writing to please the Roman establishment. Why would he make Pilate look like he had been duped or had done something incorrectly? Elsewhere near this passage, Josephus reports things that don't make Pilate smell very good, and he had no hesitation in reporting mistakes that the Romans made. i.e. the Roman soldier exposing his buttocks and making an appropriate sound to the crowd. As long as he had said nothing that made his current Roman patrons look bad, I dare say he was going to be in good shape. There's a table of contents for Josephus that doesn't mention the Testimonium. This proves it wasn't there. For this objection, we rely on material here, and once again, the link will be below, highly recommended for additional information as well, by Christopher Price, who also authored the chapter on Josephus for my book, Shattering the Christ Myth. What really sinks this objection is that the table of contents was likely not created by Christians, but by Josephus or one of his assistants. That Josephus or one of his assistants would not see any point in highlighting what they spent so little time recording is hardly surprising and in no way suggests that the TF was absent. During our debate on the TF, Kirby and I learned that the table of contents was originally written in Greek before the 6th century. Thus, it is not a 6th century Christian creation. Additionally, we learned that Professor Thackeray had addressed the origins of the table of contents. According to Thackeray, the author of the table of contents was likely a Jew and possibly one of Josephus's assistants. Josephus himself incorporated a rough summary of the whole in his Prom, and though it is improbable that these more elaborate chapter headings are the product of his pen, they may not be far removed from him in date. Henry St. John Thackeray, from Josephus, Volume 4, page 637. Thackeray goes on to suggest that the summaries were written by one of Josephus's assistants because the phraseology occasionally suggests the hand of one of the author's assistants. Given that no scholar was or is more familiar with the nuances of the style and linguistic characteristics of Josephus's writings, this opinion is entitled to substantial respect. Finally, the original table does not refer to any of the features that would have interested Christians, such as John the Baptist, James the brother of Jesus, or the death of Herod. Such omissions make sense for a Jewish author, but not for a Christian one, regardless of whether the TF existed. If Christians had originally created the table, they would not have left out those features which most interested them. The better explanation is that whoever created the summaries, they were not Christian. Thus, no significance can be gleaned from the fact that the table does not refer to the TF. What do we learn about Jesus and/or Christianity from this historian-writer? Josephus ends up being a rich source for confirmation of the gospel record. 1. Jesus had a brother named Jesus who was an important member of the church. 2. Jesus was a wise and virtuous man. 3. Jesus had disciples both among the Jews and Gentiles. Although Meyer regards the latter as retrojectory in nature, we may suggest that it is something that simply lacked emphasis in the Gospels. 4. Jesus was called Christ by some. 5. Jesus was a worker of surprising deeds, an allusion perhaps to miracle working power. 6. Jesus was executed by Pilate by means of crucifixion. 7. His execution was prompted in part by the leaders among the Jews. 8. Christians were named from him, which confirms Tacitus's own usage of the terminology. Issue of note. Some discussion has attended the argument that the Testimonium is strongly paralleled by Luke's Emmaus Road narrative. Not surprisingly, this data has been used to suggest that Luke copied Josephus or vice versa, or to suggest a common source. We now have a look at that issue here. So once again, the links are below if you want to check them out. I just wanted to give a couple of the other side of the story, basically, from the mythicists who claim that Josephus was just this stuff, that he never mentioned Jesus, when it is much more likely that it was just that over time things got added to it. Translators probably translated things in more positive light rather than the sort of critical light looking at him. The Jews could have considered Jesus to have been a wise man, like I talked about in the video Kosher Jesus, and I'll leave those links below, like I mentioned. So, like I said, just always do your research and try to figure things out yourself. These people who just believe that Jesus was a myth, they don't often give you the other side of the story. And basically, that's all I'm doing with these videos. I hope you enjoyed this. Thanks for listening. Shalom.
Chris White once coined the phrase short-term New World Order freakout syndrome to explain what it's like to have your perception of the world shattered. Of course, it's not just about the shape of the world, whether it's flat, round, or something else entirely. This New World Order freakout often includes now saying no to GMOs, fluoride, vaccines, and pharmaceuticals. It's a complete overhaul to your lifestyle. And trying to explain that mainstream media is just propaganda to promote false flags, division, and more can really put a strain on your relationships. Have you gotten tired of being mocked by your own family for what you share? We've all been there. Are you treated like the black sheep because of the commandments you keep? I get it. We're all trying to figure things out together, but sometimes you just have to let your family and friends be. Plant the seed and wait and see. But while you wait for them to catch up, do you wish you had someone to talk with who gets it? That's what Truth or Talk is for. Being able to discuss what's going on in your life and what you're interested in without feeling like you're going to be judged as a crazy conspiracy theorist who should be on drugs or committed. No subject is taboo, and I'd love to hear from you. Simply truthertalk.com. Simply make an appointment and let's talk, Truther.